The world is turning to absolute chaos. People are brawling over toilet paper, scavenging for scraps at the supermarket, and avoiding anyone and everyone like the plague. So how are governments attempting to bring order? The answer: quarantine. It might seem as simple as stay inside or face the wrath, but there's actually a lot more to it. What exactly is quarantine? How is it enforced? And how much actual trouble can we get into if we break it? Wash your hands, and then let's find out. Unless you've been living under a rock, it's not hard to see that things are getting pretty crazy in the world around us. 2020 is off to a rocky start. As of mid-March, 164 countries have been breached, with close to 200,000 people infected. Fewer and fewer places on Earth are remaining clean. Everywhere from Iceland to Barbados, Chile, Canada, and French Polynesia have been infected. All this after news first broke of a dangerous new virus in China. While the outbreak did start in the Wuhan area of China, the bulk of the cases these days are found outside its borders, with the virus having spread internationally. But how did it all start? The source of it is thought to be contaminated bats that were being sold at a so-called wet market in Wuhan. As we've seen, the figures have grown exponentially. However, the world is now responding and putting in measures all over the globe to flatten the curve. One of those pivotal measures is quarantine. We're sure that you've heard this word thrown around over the last few weeks, but what does it even mean? In official terms, quarantine is a public health practice used to stop or limit the spread of a disease. But in easier-to-digest terms, it basically means don't go outside when you're sick, because then you'll get everybody you touch sick, and then they will get everybody they know sick, and so on and so on and so forth until the world explodes with bacteria and confetti. Comprende? In essence, it's a precautionary approach to isolate everything contagious. One important thing to keep in mind is that there is a significant difference between a suggestion of quarantine, or self-isolation as the big bosses are calling it, and a legal quarantine order. "We recommend you stay inside" is not the same as "if you leave your house, we will lock you up in prison until you're old and gray." As it stands, every country has a different level of strictness. Australia, for example, suggests minimizing social contact. Italy, on the other hand, has forced its residents to stay inside their own homes, whether they're sick or not. But what happens if you scoff at the legal system and just try to go about your regular daily routine? By breaking quarantine procedures, can we actually get in trouble? Absolutely! Depending on which country you're currently in, and furthermore, if you're in the USA, which state you're currently in, you can even get locked up behind bars. To the folks up in Vermont, you can be imprisoned for up to 2 years for spreading a contagious disease beyond the quarantine zone. For those in Maryland and the snow bunnies up in Alaska, it's just the 1 year. But for any of you guys who call Mississippi home, watch out. If you knowingly or willingly violate a quarantine order, even if you don't actually infect anyone else, you can end up behind bars for 5 years. Crazy, right? Guess it's time to binge some new TV shows then. What's weird about this, though, is that in places like Texas, a quarantined person isn't even allowed to invite their friends over to hang out and binge watch with them. Lonely days. Where the recent disease has caused a much larger stir is in Italy, and the punishment is much more severe there. For Italians who dare to breach the lockdown, they could face a whopping 21 years in prison. Up in the Great White North, it's not as bad in comparison, with a potential 3-year sentence. But what'll really get Canadians tearing up are the hefty fines. So, if you decide to risk it all, here's what you can expect to have deducted from your bank balance. At the lower end of the spectrum, failing to comply with quarantine laws can mean a $200,000 fine. That's more than 4 times the average annual income of Canada's citizens. But if you break the laws and your actions result in someone else falling ill or worse, then that number goes way, way up. In the worst-case scenario, Canada's quarantine penalties can be up to $1 million. So think twice. But what about the good old US of A? How much can we expect to pay in America? It depends on what state you're in. In places like Montana and New Jersey, it's nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Fines merely range between $10 and $100 for those convicted of breaking quarantine. In Nevada, it can be up to $1,000. And that is doubled for Hawaii. Up in Vermont, if you spread anything contagious, you're looking at a whopping $15,000. Yikes. Usually the rules for monetary punishments are straightforward, but sometimes things can get pretty darn weird. Take Alabama, for example. If you're a train conductor in Alabama and refuse to let a quarantine officer ride the train for free, you can be personally fined between $50 and $100. It's not just the fines that can get a little strange. The places that governments and councils are choosing to quarantine their citizens is getting more and more obscure by the day. We've all seen the videos of the Italians singing to each other from their balconies, right? If you haven't, just take a moment to enjoy. The reason why they're bellowing from the balconies is because Italy instructed, nay, demanded that they stay inside their homes. In Australia, those who were coming back from China were forced to hang out on a place called Christmas Island for a couple of weeks. It sounds like a candy cane oasis, but in reality, it's normally used as a detention center. Less fun. And you've all heard about the cruise ships, right? All over the world, these floating retirement villages have become incubators for the disease. These giant ships were docking at different countries, but since they were full of infected people, those countries were refusing to let them in. That, in essence, made the ships quarantine vessels without their permission. Weird, isn't it? You set off to enjoy the sunshine one day and then be locked inside your 5-foot cabin indefinitely the next? It was a similar story for planes. Stories have come out of different aircraft from different companies at all kinds of various airports and countries, simply being stuck on the tarmac for hours on end. How would you react if you were stuck in limbo like that? Lockouts and quarantines are one thing, but what about curfews? Back when Ebola was the main threat, Liberia, that's here, actually imposed a nighttime curfew in addition to quarantining off an area of the capital city, Monrovia. These days, however, the thought of a curfew is much closer to home. Believe it or not, residents in New Jersey have been instructed to avoid non-essential travel between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. In Jersey, as well as a number of neighboring states, they've closed casinos, movie theaters, and gyms until further notice. And over in cities like Columbia in South Carolina, you can't even go outside, period, between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. It's a little apocalyptic and a little strange, no doubt. But those aren't even the weirdest rules that have been put into place. If you're wondering what those rules are, well, here you go. In New Mexico, if you're sick, you're allowed to refuse testing and treatment. But if you refuse, you're locked up in your house no matter what. So, even if you're scared of the thought of being tested, and not even the slightest bit sick, you're still treated like someone infected. Back in Alabama, it's the totally other end of the spectrum. This state allows people to come and go from a place under quarantine protection however they please, as long as they say they're okay. Hold up, let's get this straight. So we could go on a bar crawl, spewing up rainbows and infectious germs, but as long as we verbally announce that we're fine, it's no big deal? Oh boy. Meanwhile, over in Ohio, it's a real-life scarlet letter situation. If officials catch wind that you might be a danger to society, then expect a so-called placard on your house announcing that you're infected. In Italy, they've enforced the rule that residents in the majorly affected cities are banned from traveling in and out of the city. That odd rule is actually what started the whole problem, because people panicked and boarded the last trains and buses out of the region to wherever they could go, just so they wouldn't be caged up in a citywide lockdown. The country has also closed all shops except for food stores and pharmacies. So, even if they want to, locals are banned from playing soccer, going to church, and heading over to Nona's for a hearty bolognese. In the origin nation of China, it's an equivalent story. For those who aren't boarded up, some workers have to submit daily health checks when they arrive at work. This includes scanning a QR code and registering in order to actually enter the office areas. The government has also kept mainstream Western social media channels like Facebook and Instagram off limits to its citizens, meaning that it's much more difficult to get a clear idea of what's going on in the rest of the world. In the UK, as well as in Australia, people are still in panic mode. Supermarkets have actually begun implementing their own rules to customers. In some stores like Tesco and Costco, strict limits are put in place on the number of toilet paper rolls that people can buy. Save some for the rest of us. There's a like-minded rule that infiltrated the majority of smaller supermarkets and dollar stores as well. 2 packets of pasta per person. Clearly, this hasn't always gone down well, and people have gotten into some pretty heated arguments as a result. It's not just grocery stores that are getting more obscure by the minute. Medical procedures are as well, and you don't even have to be at the hospital or a doctor's office. As soon as you step off a plane in an airport, if your flight wasn't canceled, that is, then expect your forehead to be immediately scanned with an infrared thermometer. And if symptoms show up, then trust us, there'll be plenty more tests coming your way lickety-split. Even so-called normal places like restaurants and bars are implementing wild measures. Want to go out to a club for a dance? Or an Irish pub for a pint of Guinness? Well, assuming that they're still allowed to be open. In addition to showing your ID to prove your age, you will also have to show your body no-touch temperature with a thermometer to prove that you're healthy. 2020 has been a wild year so far, that is for sure. But it's not the first time that the world has faced adversity. As humans, we've been put into quarantine time and time again. The difference this year is technology. It's become the talk of the town because in an age of the internet, information spreads like wildfire. Over 100 years ago, the polio epidemic struck the USA, leaving New York City particularly affected. Thousands of people caught the infectious disease, and not everyone recovered. What was odd back then, however, was that authorities began forcibly separating kids from their parents, placing the young ones in quarantine. Here's the catch. Wealthy parents were allowed to keep their sick children at home, as long as they provided a separate room for them. From June until the year's end, the infection ran its course. On the morning of April 26, 1986, another event happened. One that would create a quarantine zone like we had never seen before. Any guesses? Yes, the Chernobyl reactor explosion. The leaking radiation from the nuclear power plant not only forced every human within a 19-mile radius to observe an exclusion zone, but it also forced all plants, animals, clothes, houses, and soil to be quarantined as well. Unlike an infectious disease, radiation doesn't go away very quickly. And as we've learned, sometimes it's not just people who need to be protected in quarantine, but entire areas and everything within it. How have you been affected by what's going on in the world right now? Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and thank you for checking out The Richest. Be smart and safe, everybody, and we'll see you next time.